The morning light came soft through wheat that September, filtering gold across the Kansas prairie like a promise the world had forgotten how to keep. The year was 1943, and war had turned the earth strange. In Europe, cities burned. In the Pacific, men drowned in jungles that swallowed their names. But here, on the edge of America, where sky met soil in an endless handshake, something impossible was about to happen. Friedrich Baumann stood behind barbed wire at Camp Concordia, his hands raw from threshing wheat on a farm 5 miles south. The sun baked his neck through the threadbare collar of his Afrika Korps uniform. The tan fabric faded to the colour of dust and memory. He was 26, though his eyes looked older, the kind of eyes that had watched Tobruk fall and watched friends disappear into Tunisian sand. When the surrender came in May of 43, he had felt relief mixed with shame, a cocktail that still burned his throat months later. The camp sprawled. Behind him, 300 buildings on 640 acres, holding more than 4,000 German prisoners. It was the largest POW camp in Kansas, staffed by 800 American soldiers who watched them with a mixture of suspicion and boredom. The Geneva Convention said they were to be fed, clothed, allowed to send mail. It said nothing about dignity. That, Friedrich had learned, was something you either kept or lost on your own. That afternoon, a farmer named Jacob Wiebe arrived at the camp gate in a Ford pickup truck that sounded like it was held together by prayer and baling wire. He was Mennonite, descended from Germans who had fled to Kansas 70 years earlier, escaping the same hatreds that now tore Europe apart. His face was weathered like barnwood, his hands thick with the kind of strength that came from pulling calves and mending fences before dawn. He spoke to the guard in English, then switched to German when Friedrich and 3 other prisoners were brought. Forward. "I need men for the harvest," he said, his low German accent warm as bread. "The wheat won't wait for politics." Friedrich climbed into the truck bed with the others, their American guard, a young private named Danny Carson from Nebraska, riding up front with his rifle across his lap. As they drove through Concordia, people stopped to stare. Some waved cautiously. Others turned away, remembering sons who would never come home. The truck rattled past the courthouse, past the movie theatre showing Casablanca, past a diner where the smell of fried chicken made Friedrich's stomach ache with longing for flavours he'd forgotten existed. The Wiebe farm sat beneath an enormous sky, cornfields stretching to the horizon like an ocean frozen mid-wave. The house was simple, white clapboard with a porch that sagged gently under the weight of years. Inside, Maria Wiebe was setting the table for Sunday dinner, though it was only Saturday. She had heard prisoners were coming and decided that, if men were going to work her land, they would eat her food. It was as simple as that. But simple, Friedrich would learn, was not the same as easy. When they stepped onto the porch, boots heavy with field dust, Maria appeared at the door. She was small, barely 5 feet, but her presence filled the frame like light fills a room. She looked at them, not with pity or fear, but with something Friedrich couldn't name. Recognition, maybe. The kind that says, "I see you are human before I see anything else." She said in German, "Wash your hands. Dinner is ready." If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Friedrich hesitated. The guard, Carson, looked uncertain, his hand tightening on his rifle. In training, they'd been told the Germans were fanatics, monsters in human skin, men who'd march through hell for Hitler and wouldn't think twice about slitting American throats. But the only throat-cutting happening here was the smell of pot roast drifting through the screen door, sharp and merciless in its perfection. "Sir," Carson started, but Maria cut him off with a glance. "You too," she said in careful English. "All of you. There is enough." They filed inside, and Friedrich's breath caught. The walls were covered in wooden plaques, hand-carved in Gothic script. "Gott ist die Liebe, God is love. Wo Glaub, da Liebe, wo Liebe, da Friede. Where there is faith, there is love. Where there is love, there is peace." The words were German, old German, the kind his grandmother had spoken. His eyes burned, and he looked away quickly before anyone could see. At the table, Maria served pot roast with potatoes and carrots, fresh bread still warm from the oven, butter that tasted like clouds had been churned into cream. The prisoners sat stiffly at first, forks hovering over plates like they were handling grenades. Jacob bowed his head and said grace in German. His voice, low and steady. Komm, Herr Jesu, say unser Gast. Come, Lord Jesus, be our guest. The words unlocked something in Friedrich. He bowed his head, and for the first time since Tunisia, he prayed. Not for victory or survival, but for forgiveness he wasn't sure he deserved. As they ate, Jacob asked them about their families, where they were from, what they did before the war. One prisoner, Hans, had been a machinist in Hamburg. Another, Otto, a teacher from Berlin. Friedrich told them he'd worked in his father's bakery in Köln, the smell of rye bread rising before dawn like incense. Jacob listened, nodding, asking questions that had nothing to do with war and everything to do with life. Carson, the guard, sat at the end of the table, his rifle propped against the wall now, forgotten. He ate slowly, watching the exchange like a man witnessing something he'd been told was impossible. At one point, Maria offered him more potatoes, and he stammered a thank you, his Midwestern politeness, colliding with his military training in a way that left him bewildered. After the meal, they sat on the porch while the sun melted into the wheat fields, turning the world bronze. Otto, the teacher, looked at the horizon and said softly, "In Germany, they told us Americans had no souls, that they were savages who would torture us." Jacob didn't answer right away. He packed his pipe, lit it, let the smoke drift into the evening. Finally, he said. Otto's voice cracked. "I think I've been lied to about many things." The silence that followed was heavier than any bomb Friedrich had felt in Africa. It was the silence of men realizing that the enemy they'd been taught to hate looked a lot like them, sounded a lot like them, prayed a lot like them. It was the silence of propaganda shattering against the simple, devastating truth of kindness. As they drove back to camp that evening, Carson sat in the truck bed with the prisoners, his rifle slung casually over his shoulder. He offered Friedrich a cigarette, and they smoked in silence, watching the stars come out over Kansas like they'd been there all along, waiting for someone to notice. Back at Camp Concordia, word spread quickly. The prisoners from the Wiebe farm returned different, quieter, their eyes carrying something new. When roll call came the next morning, Friedrich stood at attention, but his mind was still on that porch, that table, those words carved into wood. Where there is love, there is peace. It was a lie, of course. The world was at war. Peace was a fantasy for children and fools. But standing there in the Kansas dawn, with wheat smell in the air and the memory of pot roast in his belly, Friedrich wondered if maybe, just maybe, peace wasn't something you waited for. Maybe it was something you built. One meal at a time, one handshake at a time, one moment of human decency at a time. He didn't know it yet, but that Sunday dinner would become the first of many, and those dinners would crack open something in him and in hundreds of other prisoners that no amount of propaganda could seal shut again. They would learn, slowly and painfully, that the enemy wasn't across the table. The enemy was the lie that said there had to be enemies at all. The weeks that followed moved with the rhythm of harvest, a cadence older than war. Each morning, trucks arrived at Camp Concordia to collect prisoners for farm work. The system had been established by military order, governed by the Geneva Convention of 1929, which had never been tested on this scale before. Farmers paid the government 35 to 45 cents per hour per labourer. The prisoners received 80 cents a day for themselves, pocket money to spend in the camp canteen on cigarettes and soap, small luxuries that felt like dignity. But something else was happening. Something the military manuals hadn't accounted for. The invisible wall between captor and captive was developing cracks. Friedrich returned to the Wiebe farm every week. Each time, Maria set the table. Each time, the food was abundant, almost obscene in its plenty. Pot roast gave way to fried chicken, then pork chops, then beef stew thick enough to stand a spoon in. There were always vegetables, fresh from the garden, and bread and butter, and sometimes pie, apple, or cherry, the crust flaking like autumn leaves. The prisoners marveled at it. In Germany, their families were scraping by on ration cards that promised food but delivered hunger. Letters from home, when they came, spoke of empty shelves and children with hollow cheeks. Hans received a letter from his wife in Hamburg, saying she'd traded her wedding ring for a loaf of bread. Otto's mother wrote that his younger brother had been conscripted at 16 and sent to the Eastern Front. The letters smelled of smoke and desperation. But here, on this Kansas farm, there was abundance. It confused them at first, then shamed them, and finally broke, something open inside them. The realization that everything they'd been told about America, about the decadence and weakness of the West, was propaganda dressed up as truth. One Sunday, after the work was done and the dinner plates cleared, Jacob invited them into the parlor. He pulled out a photo album, the kind with black pages and corner mounts. The pictures showed generations of Wiebes, stern-faced ancestors in formal dress, children playing in wheat fields, wedding photos where everyone looked serious because smiling cost too much film. "My grandfather came from Prussia in 1874, Jacob said, his finger tracing a sepia-toned face. He left because men with power told him who to hate and who to fight. He wanted no part of it. He looked up at the prisoners. The man's face could have been his own grandfather's. For a moment, he felt dizzy, like the ground beneath him had shifted. He'd been taught that Americans were foreigners, strangers, the other. But these people spoke his language, shared his ancestors, remembered the same hymns. The only thing that made them different was an ocean crossed and a choice made generations ago. "Why do you do this?" Friedrich asked suddenly. "Why feed us? Why treat us like people?" Maria, who had been knitting in the corner, looked up, her hands stilled. "Because you are people," she said simply. "That hasn't changed." "But we fought for," Friedrich started. But she cut him off. "You fought because you were told to. Now you're here. What you do next is your choice." She returned to her knitting, needles clicking softly. "We believe in healing wounds, not making new ones. That's what it means to follow Christ." Carson, the guard, who had been sitting quietly by the door, spoke up. "Ma'am, regulations say I'm supposed to prevent fraternization between prisoners and civilians." His voice was uncertain, like a man reading a script he no longer believed. Maria smiled. "Is feeding hungry men fraternization? If so, then I suppose I'm guilty." She looked at him directly. "Will you arrest me, Mr. Carson?" He flushed red. "No, ma'am." "I reckon not." The truth was, Carson had stopped seeing these men as the enemy weeks ago. At night, when they sat around after work, they'd tell stories. Hans talked about his daughter, who was 7, and loved to draw horses. Otto recited poetry, Goethe and Heine, verses about longing and home. Friedrich spoke rarely, but when he did, it was about bread, about the alchemy of flour and water and yeast, about how his father had taught him that feeding people was a kind of love. Carson found himself writing about it in letters to his fiancée back in Lincoln. "They're not what I expected," he wrote. "They laugh at the same jokes. They miss their families. They get homesick just like us. It makes me wonder what we're even fighting for." By October, the pattern had solidified. The Wiebes weren't the only ones. Across Wabaunsee County, across Cloud County, across the Kansas plains, farmers began inviting prisoners to their tables. Some did it quietly, almost ashamed. Others did it defiantly, as if daring anyone to stop them. The prisoners were good workers, careful with tools, respectful of the land. More than that, many of them spoke German. And for the aging immigrants who still preferred Low German to English, it was like having family around again. At the farm of Raymond Morton near Wamego, prisoners helped build a new barn. When the work was done, Morton's wife, Helen, insisted they stay for dinner. She made sauerbraten and potato pancakes, recipes her mother had brought from Westphalia. The prisoners ate in silence, tears streaming down their faces. One of them, a man named Wilhelm, said it tasted exactly like his grandmother's cooking. Helen cried too, and later told her husband, "They're somebody's sons, That's all that matters. But not everyone approved. A reporter from the Wichita Beacon got wind of the story and wrote an article headlined, "Nazi War Prisoners at Peabody Coddled." The piece accused farmers of being too soft, of treating the enemy like guests instead of captives. It sparked outrage in some quarters. Letters poured into military offices. How dare they feed Germans roast beef, while American boys were eating K-rations in foxholes? The military responded with a terse reminder. Prisoners were being treated according to the Geneva Convention. No more, no less. The work they performed was legal. The meals provided were within guidelines. But the guidelines said nothing about Sunday dinners in family parlours. They said nothing about German wall plaques or shared prayers, or the quiet erosion of hate that happened when people broke bread together. At Camp Concordia, the commanding officer, Colonel Robert Hayes, watched the situation carefully. He was a career military man, 48 years old, with a son, fighting in the Pacific. He had every reason to hate Germans. His brother had died at Bastogne, cut down by artillery in snow that ran red for days. But Hayes was also practical. The prisoners who worked on farms were calmer, more cooperative. They caused fewer problems. And the farmers, God bless them, were producing record harvests despite the labour shortage. If feeding a few Germans pot roast kept the wheels turning, then so be it. Still, he worried. What happened when the war ended? What happened when these men, who had tasted American abundance and American kindness, returned to a Germany that was being bombed into dust? Would they become ambassadors of goodwill, or would they carry resentment that America had so much while their families had nothing? One evening, Hayes drove out to the Wiebe farm unannounced. He wanted to see for himself what was happening. He arrived just as the prisoners were finishing dinner. Jacob invited him in without hesitation, offered him coffee. They sat on the porch as the sun set, painting the wheat gold and crimson. "Why do you do this?" Hayes asked, echoing Friedrich's question. Jacob was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "My faith teaches that we're all made in God's image, even the enemy, maybe especially the enemy. If we can't see that, then what are we fighting for?" Hayes had no answer. He drove back to camp in the dark, the headlights cutting through Kansas night, and thought about his brother in that Belgian snow. Would his brother have wanted revenge? Or would he have wanted something better, something that actually meant something? Back at camp, Friedrich lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. He'd been at Concordia for 4 months. In that time, he'd threshed wheat, repaired fences, milked cows, and eaten more food than he'd seen in 2 years of war. He'd been treated with more kindness by strangers than he'd received from his own officers. And slowly, painfully, about defending the fatherland. It had been about lies told so many times they'd calcified into truth. He thought about Maria Wiebe's wooden plaques. "Where there is love, there is peace." The words haunted him. He'd spent years learning to hate, to see enemies everywhere. It had been easy. Hate was simple. It required seeing humanity in places you'd been taught to see nothing. He didn't know it yet, but across the camp, hundreds of men were wrestling with the same realization. They'd come to America expecting brutality and found mercy. They'd expected starvation and found abundance. And slowly, in Sunday dinners and porch conversations and shared cigarettes after work, they were learning that the real enemy had never been the American across the table. It had been the lie that said there had to be an enemy at all. The winter of 1943 came early to Kansas, bringing snow that turned the prairie into a vast white silence. At Camp Concordia, the prisoners huddled in barracks, heated by coal stoves that never quite banished the cold. Outside, the wind howled across the plains like a living thing, carrying with it the memory of every winter that had ever been. But even as temperatures dropped, something unexpected was warming. The Sunday dinners continued. On a December morning when frost turned the barbed wire into crystal lace, Friedrich and 5 other prisoners climbed into the back of a truck headed for the Penner farm near Peabody. Their guard that day was a different man, Sergeant Bill Morrison from Texas, who carried his rifle like he meant it. Unlike Carson, Morrison didn't smile. He'd lost friends at Anzio, and the sight of German uniforms made his jaw tight. "Don't think I've gone soft," Morrison said as they drove. "You're prisoners. That's all you are." Friedrich nodded, said nothing. He'd learned that some wounds ran too deep for Sunday dinners to heal. Some men needed to hold on to their hate, because letting go meant facing a grief they couldn't survive. The Penner farm was smaller than the Wiebes, but the welcome was just as warm. Frieda Penner, a woman of about 40 with flour permanently dusted into her apron, greeted them at the door. She spoke rapid-fire Low German, gesturing them inside before Morrison could object. Within minutes, they were seated at a rough-hewn table, steam rising from bowls of chicken soup thick with noodles and vegetables. Morrison stood by the door, rifle in hand, watching. Frieda brought him a bowl, set it on a small table beside him. "Eat," she said in English. "Standing makes poor digestion." "I'm on duty, ma'am." "Then sit while you're on duty. Food doesn't know the difference." Despite himself, Morrison sat. The soup was good, better than good. It tasted like the kind of thing his grandmother made, back when the world made sense. He ate slowly, watching the prisoners eat, watching the way Frieda moved between them like a mother tending sons. One of the prisoners, a young man named Joseph, couldn't have been more than 19. He had a photograph of his mother that he carried everywhere, the edges worn soft from handling. After the meal, Frieda's husband, Walter, asked if any of the prisoners could help fix a broken wagon wheel. Friedrich volunteered. He'd learned carpentry from his father. The precision required to shape dough translated well to shaping wood. As he worked, his hands remembered old rhythms, the satisfaction of making something broken whole again. Walter watched him work, impressed by his skill. "You're good with your hands," he said. "My father taught me," Friedrich replied. He said every man should know how to build things, not just destroy them. The words hung in the cold air. Walter glanced at Morrison, who was pretending not to listen. "Your father sounds like a wise man." "He was." Friedrich's voice dropped. "He died in 41, bombing raid. The British." The silence that followed was complicated, layered with all the things war made impossible to say. Walter finally cleared his throat. "I'm sorry for your loss." Friedrich nodded, kept working. What else was there to say? Sorry seemed too small a word for the ocean of grief between them. That evening, as they prepared to leave, something unusual happened. Frieda's youngest child, a 3-year-old girl named Anna, toddled up to Joseph. She held out a small cloth doll, offering it shyly. Joseph knelt down, his eyes suddenly bright. He took the doll, examined it carefully, then handed it back with exaggerated solemnity. He said in German, "You must take very good care of her." Anna giggled and ran back to her mother. Joseph stood there, frozen, his throat working. Morrison saw it, saw the naked longing on the young prisoner's face, and for the first time since Anzio, something in him softened just slightly. The kid was missing his family, that was all. Just missing his family. On the ride back, Morrison didn't say anything, but he didn't grip his rifle quite so hard either. By Christmas, the transformation at Camp Concordia had become undeniable. The German government, through the Red Cross, sent a freight car full of gifts for the prisoners. Each compound received a Christmas tree. The mess hall served turkey dinner. The prisoners organized a nativity play, performed entirely in German, and some of the American guards attended, sitting in the back, not understanding the words, but understanding the meaning well enough. Colonel Hayes authorized a special evening where prisoners could sing Christmas carols. Friedrich stood with hundreds of others in the cold December night, their voices rising into the darkness. They sang Still Nacht, Silent Night, the carol written in Austria more than a century before. The words drifted across the prairie, and in town, people stopped to listen. Some closed their windows, unable to bear the sound of German voices singing about peace. Others stood on their porches, tears freezing on their cheeks, wondering how the world had gotten so strange that enemy soldiers singing about the birth of Christ could make them weep. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. After Christmas, the letters from Germany grew darker. Hans received word that his wife and daughter had been evacuated from Hamburg after a firestorm killed 40,000 people in a single night. Otto learned his younger brother was missing on the Eastern Front, last seen near a place called Kursk. Friedrich got a Red Cross message saying his mother was alive, but their apartment building was gone. She was living in a church basement with 30 other families, surviving on turnip soup and stale bread. The contrast became unbearable. Here they sat, growing fat on American plenty, while their families starved. Some prisoners stopped eating, overcome by guilt. Others ate desperately, as if storing up calories against a future they couldn't imagine. The camp chaplain, Father O'Brien, an Irish Catholic priest from Boston, held extra services. He had no answers, only presence, the ancient comfort of ritual in a world gone mad. The farmers noticed the change. At the Wiebe farm, Friedrich sat at the Sunday table but barely touched his food. Maria watched him for a moment, then quietly wrapped half the meal in cloth and handed it to him as he left. For later, she said, they both knew he'd share it with others back at camp, that it would be divided into impossibly small portions and savoured like communion. This happened more and more. Farmers began sending food back with the prisoners, officially forbidden but tacitly allowed, packages of flour, rice, and cornmeal. Jacob Wiebe went further. He asked Friedrich for his mother's address in Köln and sent her a care package through the Red Cross. The gesture stunned Friedrich into speechlessness. Here was a man whose taxes were funding the war against Germany, using his own money to feed a German woman he'd never met. Why? Friedrich finally managed to ask. Jacob shrugged. Because she's someone's mother. That's enough. The act of kindness broke something in Friedrich. That night, back in his bunk, he wept for the first time since his capture. Not from grief, but from the overwhelming, terrible knowledge that mercy was real, that it existed even here, even now, even after everything. And if it was real, then everything he'd been taught, everything he'd believed about the world being divided into us and them, was a lie. He wasn't the only one. Across the camp, men were having similar reckonings. The hardline Nazis, the true believers, retreated into bitter resentment. They saw the kindness as weakness, as American softness that proved they were unfit to rule the world. In the spring of '44, over 100 of these men were transferred to a stricter camp in Alva, Oklahoma, removed like infection from a healing wound. But for the rest, something was shifting. The Camp Concordia prisoners began their own education program, teaching each other English, mathematics, engineering, theology. The University of Kansas partnered with them, offering courses. Even the German Reich's Ministry of Education approved it, and 15 German and Austrian universities agreed to honor any credits earned. It was surreal, enemy soldiers taking college classes in the middle of a war, but it gave them something to hope for beyond the wire. Friedrich enrolled in a course on American literature. He read Walt Whitman, Mark Twain, and Emily Dickinson. The words astonished him. Here were Americans writing about democracy, about individual dignity, about the worth of every person regardless of station. It was everything the Reich had taught him to despise, and yet reading it, he felt something in him come alive that had been sleeping for years. One Sunday in March of 1944, after dinner at the Wiebe farm, Jacob asked Friedrich if he'd like to attend church with them. Friedrich hesitated. He'd been raised Lutheran, but the war had burned most of the faith out of him. What God allowed such suffering? What deity watched cities burn and children starve and did nothing? But he went anyway, more out of curiosity than conviction. The Mennonite church was simple, wooden pews and plain walls, no ornate decorations or statues. The congregation sang hymns in German, the same hymns Friedrich's grandmother had sung. The preacher, an old man named Isaac Schmidt, spoke about forgiveness, not the easy kind, the kind that costs nothing, but the hard kind, the kind that required you to see your enemy as human even when every fiber of your being wanted to see them as monster. Forgiveness, Schmidt said, his voice quavering with age, is not about forgetting. It's about refusing to let hate define you. It's about choosing, every day, to see the Vart, image of God in the other, even when they've given you every reason not to. Friedrich sat in that pew, surrounded by people whose language he spoke but whose world he tried to destroy, and felt something shift inside him. It wasn't conversion, exactly. It wasn't a bolt of light or a voice from heaven. It was quieter than that. It was the slow, painful realization that he had a choice. He could hold on to the hate, let it calcify into bitterness, let it define the rest of his life, or he could let it go. Not forget, never forget, but release the grip it had on his throat. He chose the latter. It took months, years even. But sitting in that church on a Kansas Sunday, he made the choice. By summer of 1944, the tide of war had turned decisively. The Allies landed at Normandy in June. The Eastern Front collapsed as the Soviets pushed west. Italy had already surrendered, though fighting continued. In the Pacific, American forces island-hopped toward Japan. The end was visible now, though no one knew how much blood it would cost to reach it. At Camp Concordia, the prisoners followed the news with a strange mixture of emotions. They wanted Germany to surrender, wanted the killing to stop, but surrender meant defeat, meant their families would be occupied by foreign armies, meant everything they'd fought for was for nothing. Some prisoners cheered privately when they heard about Allied advances, others sank into depression. A few attempted escape, though none made it far. Where would they go? They were 3,000 miles from home, in a country where their accents marked them instantly. The farmers continued to request their labour. The harvest of 1944 was one of the best on record, and everyone knew the POWs were part of the reason. They worked hard, never complained, and treated the land with respect. More than that, they'd become part of the fabric of rural Kansas life. Children knew them by name. Women saved extra food for them. Men worked alongside them without fear. One day in August, Friedrich was working at the Wiebe farm when a car pulled up. Out stepped a woman in her 50s, well-dressed, her face set in hard lines. She marched up to Maria and said, loudly enough for everyone to hear, "How dare you feed these monsters? My son died because of them." The work stopped. Everyone froze. Maria dried her hands on her apron and looked at the woman with steady compassion. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said quietly. "Truly I am. But these men didn't kill your son. War killed your son. And if we keep feeding the war with hate, it will never end. They're Nazis," the woman spat. "They're prisoners," Maria replied, "and they're hungry. I can't bring your son back. God knows I wish I could. But I can feed these men. It's the only thing I know how to do that makes any sense anymore." The woman stared at her for a long moment, trembling with fury and grief. Then she turned and walked back to her car. As she drove away, Friedrich saw her shoulders shaking. She was weeping. For her son, yes. But maybe also for a world where feeding the enemy felt like betrayal, even when it was the most human thing to do. That night, Maria seemed older, tired in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion. Jacob held her hand as they sat on the porch. Friedrich, waiting by the truck to return to camp, heard her say, "I don't know if I'm doing the right thing. Maybe she's right. Maybe I'm dishonoring the dead." Jacob's voice was firm. "You're honoring life. That's different. The dead are beyond our help. But the living, the ones right in front of us, they need what we can give. That's not dishonor. That's faith." As the truck drove away, Friedrich looked back at the farm, at the yellow light in the kitchen window, at the figures on the porch holding each other against the dark. He thought about the woman who'd lost her son. He thought about his own mother, alone in Köln. He thought about all the mothers, everywhere, German and American and Russian and British, all of them grieving sons who'd been turned into soldiers and soldiers who'd been turned into corpses. And he thought that maybe, just maybe, the way out of this nightmare wasn't through more killing. Maybe it was through exactly what Maria Wiebe was doing, feeding people, seeing them, refusing to let hate have the last word. It was a small thing, a Sunday dinner. It wouldn't stop the war. It wouldn't bring back the dead. But it was something. And in a world drowning in darkness, even a small light mattered. By autumn of 1944, Camp Concordia had become something unprecedented. It was still a prison, still surrounded by wire and guards, but within those boundaries, a strange community had formed. The prisoners ran their own companies with minimal American oversight. They held elections, published newspapers, organized theater productions. The re-education program, officially called the Special Projects Division, screened Hollywood films and encouraged democratic thinking. Officers tried to be subtle about it, but everyone knew what was happening. They were being prepared for a Germany that would never be the Third Reich again. Not everyone accepted it. Hardcore Nazis still existed, though their numbers dwindled. They intimidated others, spread propaganda, clung to the belief that Germany would somehow win. 2 prisoners were murdered by fellow inmates for alleged disloyalty, beaten to death in brutal displays meant to enforce conformity. The perpetrators were tried and sentenced to Leavenworth Federal Prison, their violence exposed as the last gasp of an ideology built on cruelty. But for most prisoners, including Friedrich, the dream was dead. They'd seen too much, learned too much. America wasn't perfect. They saw poverty in the towns, heard about segregation and injustice, but it was fundamentally different from what they'd known. Here, people could criticize the government without disappearing. Here, newspapers printed dissenting views. Here, farmers could invite enemy prisoners to their tables and face nothing worse than neighborhood gossip. It was messy and chaotic, and sometimes hypocritical, but it was alive in a way the Reich had never been. One prisoner, a former lawyer named Klaus Hoffmann, put it best during a late-night discussion in the barracks. "They defeated us," he said, "not just with tanks and planes, but with this, with treating us like human beings. How do you fight that? How do you hold on to hate when your enemy keeps insisting on your dignity?" It was a question without an answer. In November, Roosevelt won his 4th term. The prisoners followed the election with fascination. The idea that a leader could be voted out, that power could transfer peacefully, seemed almost miraculous to men who'd known only dictatorship. When Roosevelt died in April of '45 and Truman took over without bloodshed, without coup or purge, it drove the point home even harder. This was what they'd been fighting against. And looking at it now, from behind American wire, eating American food, learning in American classrooms, they couldn't remember why. May 7th, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. At Camp Concordia, the news was met with strange, muted emotion. Relief? Yes. Grief? Absolutely. Shame? Confusion? Fear about what came next. The prisoners gathered in the mess hall, listening to the radio broadcast. Some men wept openly. Others sat in stunned silence. A few cheered, finally free to admit they were glad it was over. But mostly, there was just exhaustion, the kind that settles into bones after you've been holding your breath for years. Friedrich sat alone in the barracks that night, staring at a letter from his mother. It had arrived a week earlier, forwarded through the Red Cross. She was alive. Köln was rubble, but she'd survived. She wrote that she was proud of him for surviving too, that she didn't care about victory or defeat, only that he was alive somewhere. At the end, she included a line that hit him harder than any bomb. "Whatever you did in this war, you can still choose what kind of man you'll be after." He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his footlocker. Tomorrow, he'd write back. He'd tell her about Kansas, about wheat fields and Sunday dinners, about farmers who spoke German and invited strangers to their tables. He'd tell her that he'd seen what happened when people chose mercy over hate, and he'd tell her that when he finally came home, he wanted to be that kind of man, the kind who fed people, the kind who saw enemies as human beings first. Repatriation began in autumn of 1945. The prisoners would be sent home in waves, processed through screening to identify war criminals and hardcore Nazis. Most would be cleared, sent back to a Germany that no longer existed, that had been carved up by the Allies and occupied by foreign armies. They would return to cities that were moonscapes, to families scattered or dead, to a future uncertain and terrifying. On Friedrich's last day at the Wiebe farm, Maria cooked a special meal: sauerbraten, red cabbage, potato dumplings, apple strudel for dessert. It was a feast fit for celebration. Though no one felt much like celebrating, they ate slowly, savouring each bite, knowing it was an ending. Afterward, on the porch, Jacob gave Friedrich a package. Inside was a Bible, old and worn, with notes in the margins in German script. "It was my grandfather's," Jacob said. "The one who came from Prussia. I want you to have it." Friedrich tried to refuse. "I can't take this. It's too much." "You can," Jacob insisted. "And you will, because you're going to need reminders of what you learned here. When you get home, when things are hard, when hate tries to creep back in, open this. Remember that there's another way." Maria pressed a small package into his hands as well. Wrapped in cloth were seeds, wheat, corn, beans. "For when you're ready to plant again," she said simply. Friedrich couldn't speak. He clutched the packages to his chest, nodded, and walked to the truck before the tears could come. As they drove away, he looked back one last time. Jacob and Maria stood on the porch, waving, two small figures against the vast Kansas sky. He would never see them again, but he would carry them with him for the rest of his life. The final convoy left Camp Concordia on October 31st, 1945. Over 4,000 men had passed through the camp during its operation. Some harboured resentment and bitterness, but many, like Friedrich, carried something else. They carried the memory of Sunday dinners. They carried the knowledge that mercy was possible even in war. They carried seeds, both literal and metaphorical, that they would plant in German soil. Years later, after the rubble was cleared and the cities rebuilt, after the Wirtschaftswunder turned Germany into an economic powerhouse, after the wounds began to scar, if not heal, letters would arrive in Kansas. Farmers would receive notes from former prisoners, written in careful English or formal German, thanking them for kindness that had seemed small at the time but had changed everything. One letter, addressed to the Wiebe family, arrived in 1952. It was from Friedrich. He'd reopened his father's bakery in Köln. Business was good. He'd married, had a daughter. And every Sunday, without fail, he invited someone who needed a meal to his table. Strangers, refugees, anyone who was hungry. He wrote, "You taught me that bread shared is bread multiplied. I'm trying to live that way. It's harder than it sounds, but I'm trying." Maria read the letter aloud to Jacob while they sat on that same porch where they'd sat with prisoners nearly a decade before. When she finished, Jacob was crying, something she'd rarely seen in 40 years of marriage. Asked softly, "All those dinners, all that food, do you think it changed anything?" Jacob wiped his eyes. Changed the world? Maybe not. And Friedrich will change someone else. And that someone will change another. It's like planting seeds. You don't always see the harvest, but that doesn't mean it's not growing. The barracks of Camp Concordia were torn down in 1946 and 47. Some buildings were sold and moved into Concordia, where they still stand today, anonymous among the houses and shops. The land returned to agriculture, wheat and corn erasing any trace that 4,000 enemy soldiers once lived there. Only a few structures remain: a guard tower, a water tower foundation, markers that hint at the history beneath. But the real legacy isn't in buildings. It's in the thousands of meals shared, the thousands of conversations held, the thousands of moments when people chose to see humanity in the face of the enemy. It's in the letters that crossed the Atlantic for decades after, in the friendships that formed against all logic, in the slow transformation of hate into something more complicated and infinitely more valuable. The prisoners who worked Kansas farms during World War II carried home more than memories. They carried a vision of what the world could be if people chose mercy over vengeance, abundance over scarcity, love over hate. Not all of them lived up to it, The trauma of war and the hardship of post-war Germany broke many. But some did. They rebuilt their country with the knowledge that enemies could become neighbors, that strangers could become family, that a Sunday dinner could be an act of revolution, and the farmers who fed them carried something too. They carried the knowledge that their faith wasn't just words on wall plaques. It was practice, daily and difficult, the choice to extend hospitality even when the world said they shouldn't. They carried the memory of enemy soldiers weeping over pot, roast, of guards leaving guns on porches, of children playing with men who'd been taught to destroy. In 1943, when the first prisoners arrived in Kansas, the world was burning. Cities lay in ruins. Millions were dead. The future looked like nothing but more darkness. But in farmhouses across the prairie, in moments no one thought to record or celebrate, something else was happening. People were refusing to let hate have the final word. They were insisting, stubbornly and irrationally, that mercy mattered. They were right. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.